Hello everybody, my name is Greg Schuster, and today I would like to talk to you about one of the harder things you may be called upon to do, whether it's in the real world or in a training environment, and that's going to be the Raw Data ILS. A Raw Data ILS is defined by a Cat 1 ILS that you shoot with no flight director and no autopilot approach coupler, and that can be for a variety of failures. Honestly, a lot of those failures also end up with no auto thrust available, which is part of what makes it so challenging. I don't care if you're Bob Hoover or Chuck Yeager, this is a working man's approach. And as a guy who's gotten to watch people fly a lot of raw data ILSs, I'm here to tell you I've seen the whole spectrum. I've seen people do an outstanding job flying this. It's almost as if they're on rails. They're so locked onto Localizer, so locked onto glide slope, they take it down, break out, and the choirs of heaven sing, and they just do an awesome job. But then I've also seen grown men weep. People who are flailing with it, they just want it to end because it's going so poorly, and they're struggling very hard. So today I want to talk about some of the symbology to understand some of the tools available so that you cannot be that grown man weeping. Now, because you're so degraded when you're shooting this approach, it comes with penalties as far as what we need to fly the approach with in regards to minimums. And so you may be shooting an ILS approach, but we're going to be penalized with our minimums to use the higher of Localizer minimums or 4,3/4. Well, as is typical, if we're using the Localizer minimums, which is what you do usually end up having to work with on these, it's going to come with an MDA. And typically in today's world, that MDA effectively means we must do addition. We must add 50 feet to it. So generically, if the approach was Localizer minimums of 512, then usually we would end up at 562. The question is, do we need to do that today on a raw data ILS? And the answer to that is no. We are not shooting a Localizer approach. So we do not need to do what we usually do on a Localizer approach, which add in that 50 feet. We can just use the straight minimum, 512 in my example. And that will be just fine because we truly are shooting that ILS. All right, now, when it comes to shooting the approach, I want to set a little mental mood lighting here for success. And particularly, I want to address the pilot monitoring. Obviously, the pilot flying is going to have their hands full of airplane, basically cavemanning a very basic Airbus through the sky. But pilot monitoring, you're not just a bump on the log on this. You are always crucial to success, but perhaps never more than on one of these. So I want to set that mental psychology going on to understand that if this raw data ILS goes poorly, pilot monitoring, I'm looking at you. I want you to own responsibility for the success of this. I want you to be very active as you do this. I want you to have your communications very directive in nature. What I mean when I say that is, I don't want you describing things for the pilot flying to have to analyze. They may be STEM-only brain powers. They're trying to manhandle the airplane through the skies. I want you to be directive and just tell them what they need to do. And that can sound like, come right, get your nose down, more power, things like that. You want to be very active giving them those calls. That is like gold to somebody who's very busy doing things, because if you make it simple and you tell them just what they need to do, it really lends itself to significant success as we're working our way through this. So that's how we want to view this. Captain, if your first officer is flying the raw data and it goes poorly, it's your fault. And similarly, first officer, if the captain's flying it and it goes poorly, first officer, it's your fault. Of course, realistically, it's both of your faults, but I want that psychology to be there where you're very engaged making this all work. All right, now let's talk. We're going to talk symbology, and then we're going to talk tools that we have available to us. So when it comes to symbology, one of the things I like to do is just kind of work through what we have available. And you could break down any typical ILS into three fundamental components. We could look at it from an airspeed perspective, Localizer perspective, and a glide slope perspective. Of those three components, which one do you suppose kicks people's butts the most? And it isn't even close. And if you answered localizer, you would be correct. This is easily the one that causes people the most problems. So I am going to invest a little bit of time talking about how we can conquer the localizer beast, because this causes the issues. We really don't see too many problems in the airspeed department. You'll see some deviations, but it's nowhere near close to what we see here. And the glide slope as well, usually that's handled much, much better than the localizer. So let's walk our way through that. Excuse me. And what I like to do, it's going to sound very elementary and basic in the beginning, but stick with me. I'm going somewhere on this. And I usually tell crews, let's identify what we're looking at, and I want specific numbers like 283 or 341. And I'll say, what is the current heading of this airplane? And if they answer 341, we're good to go. Then I'll say, what is the current selected heading of this airplane? And if they answer 349, we're looking good because the blue triangle. And then I'll say, what is our current wind-adjusted track over the ground? And hopefully they get their way to the green diamond and they say 336. And then I'll say, okay, which way is the wind coming from? And hopefully they'll analyze that and say, well, if the yellow line or my heading is effectively the nose of my airplane, the green diamond is what the wind is doing to me. So I can surmise that the wind is coming from the right and blowing me left. That's a fundamental I want them to understand. Then I'll ask them, all right, what is the ILS front course that's giving me this localizer? And hopefully they'll understand that the magenta sword, or the ILS front course indicator, is what the front course is that's giving me this. Now once the scale has the sword on it, you'll see the box go away, so you won't see this value here anymore. But if the magenta sword is off the scale, then you'll have the box available, and it'll give you a value. It should give you 353 in this example, right? But that's something I want them to understand. And this icon down here has really nothing to do with the signal per se. It's simply a graphic of the value you could find on your RAD-NAV page. If I went to my RAD-NAV page, I would see the ILS frequency, the identifier, and this value, 353, and it's a blue number, and I could change it, but I just can't think of one reason why you would. But you could. But this is simply a graphic of what's on the RAD-NAV page. So it could have nothing to do with actual signal that you're receiving right now, but it's going to show you that value. All right. Once they understand all of that, and part of the reason I went down that road is to then say, all right, given everything we just said, now looking at the localizer, are we correcting towards a centered localizer or are we diverging further from it? And so hopefully they can analyze it and say, well, let's see, 353 is the ILS front course, but my ground track diamond is significantly to the left, which means I'm tracking 336 in this example. So I am deviating even further from this. So I would expect this localizer to in fact be moving off scale in short order, given what is being flown at this point. So that's a fundamental to understand. And then I'll say, okay, now in order to begin centering my localizer, what must I do? And I'll have some people say, well, I'll bring my heading to the right of the sword. The only problem with bringing your heading to the right of the sword is you're still in that winds environment that's giving you this issue. So it's possible to have my heading to the right of the sword, but my track diamond to the left of the sword, and I'm still deviating further off course. So you could boil it down to say, when you're doing your raw data ILS, I become all about diamond and sword. My green ground track diamond, showing me how I'm tracking over the ground, is the most accurate thing that I care about. And then my ILS front course is my ultimate objective of getting onto that centered localizer. So my ILS front course becomes the only thing that matters as far as what I'm referencing with my diamond. I'm always going to be driving my diamond around relative to that. And one of the cool things, if you boil that whole discussion down, is, and here's the moneymaker for this, if you remember nothing else of what I'm saying, I want you to remember this. The localizer is always, and I mean always, telling you where to put your diamond relative to the only thing that matters, which is the ILS front course. So, if my localizer's to the right, I better get my diamond to the right. To the right of what? To the right of the only thing that matters, which is going to be the sword. So I'll bring my diamond over to the right, and then and only then will I see that symbology start to correct towards the center. That is an enormously important fundamental for you to understand. Now, as my localizer centers, I want to endeavor to bring my green diamond over my localizer front course, which will effectively capture that localizer in molasses. So I want the green diamond over the sword, or the olive on the martini stick, as some people think of it. Then by definition, I am giving myself a wind-adjusted track over the ground that matches the ILS front course, which will then capture my localizer effectively in molasses. It may still move because we are imperfect human beings, but it should move so god-awful slow that it gets easy to mitigate any deviations and to correct for them because you're still so close. So again, remember, the big takeaway, the localizer's always telling you where to put your diamond relative to the only thing that matters, being the magenta sword. All right? Now, when it comes to airspeed, good news is on a number of those malfunctions we talked about, you still have your speed trend arrow. So overarchingly, I want you to always view the speed trend arrow as critiquing your power settings as far as airspeed goes. That can be very handy for you. But I would recommend in a variety of ways, just as in the same sense this magenta sword becomes kind of home base for maintaining your localizer, as you're working this problem, try to fine tune as you shoot the approach what is the proper home base that once you're where you want to be, meaning gear down, flaps full, V approach, and on glide slope, and you've got a nice power setting keeping your airspeed where it wants to be, invest a second in capturing a value that you can then make your home base. Now, if your speed deviates at all, you can step out, make a correction, set it back to that value, and now you've done a good job for mitigating deviations in the airspeed department. Some people use fuel flow, some people use N1 or EPR or donuts. I happen to be a donut guy because I don't like running digits up and down. I like just setting a sight picture and then having those values come and meet me there. I feel like I can set that donut quicker than I can set the other ones, but I don't really care which one you use, just pick something and get good at it, all right? So for me, depending on if I'm in a 319 or a 320 or a 321, 319s or 320s is about 8:45 on the clock, just short of a 9 o'clock position with the donuts. Does a nice job for getting you very, very close to where the power needs to be for that approach. But then from there, I watch how it does, and I always fine tune it, and I'll shift my home base a little bit once I figure out for that given day, at that given weight, at that approach, this is where the power needs to be, and then that becomes my power home base. I step out, make corrections, and I go back to it, and now I'm doing a wonderful job keeping my airspeed from significantly deviating. So that should be kind of a mentality that you have as you do all of that. Now, as far as the glide slope goes, once you are geared down, flaps full, V approach, coming down the glide slope, on any approach, take a look at out normal operations on the line, take a look at where your pitch box is. And you're going to see your pitch box, oftentimes, sitting perfectly on that 2.5 degree shelf. So I would submit to you that maybe the best going in best guess for what pitch attitude for gear down, flaps full V approach is going to give me that desired 700 to 800 feet per minute VSI that I'm going to want for your typical 3 degree ILS. Make that your going in best guess. Then watch it as you go, and if you need to tweak it a little bit, maybe you'll have to bisect the box in half with the 2.5 degree pitch beam. It all depends on weight and speed, that sort of a thing. But I'm going to be very close, which means my deviations will be very slow, and then I'm just going to fine tune it from there until I figure out exactly what is keeping me where I want it to be for today. So Factor that in as a going in best guess as you work all of that, and you can be doing some good work. Now, I would be remiss in a discussion of raw data ILS if I didn't invest a fair amount of time into discussing the flight path vector, or the bird. Depending on your background, you may be very comfortable using the bird, or you may be very uncomfortable. I see some people who love the bird, and then I see people who treat it like Dracula treats the cross, like, ew, he's got that bird thing going over there. You can see their bodies tense up, and they're just not comfortable with what they're seeing there. But I'm here to tell you, properly understood, bringing in track FPA is enormously powerful when it comes to flying this raw data ILS approach. So it's too powerful to leave out of the discussion. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. But let me also address one other thing that plays into bird usage, but even if I'm not using the bird, I would want to understand and do 100% of the time. And that is, if I have some given failures that are by definition taking away my flight director, which is part of what's making me do this raw data ILS, I will most likely have a red FD on my PFD, letting me know that that flight director is not available. It's not working for this approach. And it's kind of out of the way, and you might make the argument, well, I can't get a flight director anyway, and I've got a red FD that's not really bothering me in any sense, so who cares? And you might just be tempted to leave it at that. But I'm here to tell you, you get something really, really good by getting rid of the FD, the red FD that's going on there. You're going to get something that's too good to pass up. And what I mean by that is, if you deselect your flight director button on your FCU panel, that will make the red FD go away, but more importantly, it's going to bring this blue line in, which is going to be your selected heading index, or if you're in track FPA, it'll be your selected track index. This is enormously valuable because you're hand flying everything. When ATC's given you vectors, as you get close to the heading that they've assigned you, the blue line comes onto the stage as an excellent attention getter, reminding you, oh yeah, I need to be rolling out right here. I can't tell you how many crews I've seen who didn't do this, who just left the red FD up. I'm giving them vectors, working them in for the approach, and they're blowing through headings and all that because they own it all and their brain cells are somewhere else and they just are blown through headings. But if you bring in the selected heading index as you're being vectored around, it will always get your attention as it arrives on the stage of the PFD here, and it'll let you know, oh yeah, I need to roll out here as I'm following all of those vectors. So it's useful in that regard. And then, once I'm established on the approach, I've been cleared the approach, I've got Localizer alive and all that, for me, I just tell the pilot monitoring, dial in the ILS front course, whatever that is, 353 in this example here, I'll just say dial in 353 and leave it there. Why do I want them to leave it there? Because now I've got a selected track index. And if I maneuver my bird directly underneath this blue lubber line, I am handing myself a wind-adjusted track to keep my localizer centered, which is why it's too powerful to pass up. The Airbus is bringing magic into your life. It's doing all the mathematics in the background. It's telling you, hey, if you want to fly a selected track, then here's where you need to put your bird, right underneath this lubber line there. So as my localizer centers here, I fly my bird underneath it. I almost think of the bird, if you think about it when you're looking at it, as the backside of a submarine. I'm going to bring my bird directly under that blue lubber line for sort of a up periscope baby sight picture, and that will do a wonderful job of giving me a 353 track over the ground, which will do an awesome job of, again, capturing that localizer in molasses, which is what it's all about. So too powerful to pass up. Bring that into your world. Just have them set that 353, and now that becomes home base. You can step out, make corrections, and then go back to that up periscope sight picture with the bird, and you are doing an awesome job of kicking the localizer butt. All right, now we can also use the bird for glide slope control. For glide slope control, the bird is always giving you, once again, that Airbus magic where it's doing all the math. Here is the pitch attitude you need to get yourself 3 degrees down in our example here. Now, if I was Airbus King for the day, I would put a 3-degree tick mark on both sides of the pitch scale, because in this degraded situation, that would be enormously useful. But unfortunately, we don't have such a 3-degree tick mark, so we need to surmise it a different way. So what I'm going to recommend you do if you are using the bird is to reference the belly of the bird. And what I'll do is I'll lower that belly of the bird until it's about 1 pixel of dirt above the minus 5 degree pitch line. If I do that, that seems to be the value that keeps you right at that desired 3-degree angle. I tried the belly on the bird, but it seemed like it was just a little too nose down, and I would find myself getting low and having to correct and getting low. But if you put 1 pixel of dirt under the belly, that seems to be what you need to keep that generic 3-degree collide slope right where you want it to be. So factor that into your bag of tricks. If you're using the bird, reference the belly of the bird. It's just a smidge above the minus 5 degree tick mark, and you can be doing some good work with all of that. Now, finally, I want to talk about a significant threat in shooting this sort of approach. So significant, I'm going to strongly recommend that you make this part of your threat forward briefing as you're briefing up for the approach. And here's the thing that is such a threat. You're going to get so good at doing this as a crew, if you're like most people. You're going to get really warmed up to hand flying the airplane around. Your pilot monitoring is going to get in a groove of giving you that directive come right, come left, get your nose down, more power, all that sort of stuff is really coming together nicely. The problem is that's all taking you out of normal and normal habit patterns. So as you're shooting the approach, I have seen it time and time again where crews get so good at doing all of that that they lose all awareness to minimums. The approaching minimums never happens. The minimums would have never happened because they're just so wrapped up in the details of this that they're losing that big picture. So I want you to first understand that that is a threat, and second, I want you to emphasize that in the brief. Challenge each other, hey, today, because we're outside of our normal habit patterns and we're so degraded, let's really be aware that losing awareness to minimums is a threat, and let's not be those guys who do that. So try to do that as best you can. All right? To recap, I'll just cover a couple of key points. Pilot monitoring, if this goes poorly, I'm looking at you. It's your fault, even though it's both of your fault, right? But I want that mentality. Localizer's always telling you where to put your diamond. That red FD is a reminder that we can do better. We can bring in that blue lubber line, which really helps us in vectors and on final. And then finally, I want you to understand you have got selectable magic at your fingertips by bringing in the bird. Because it's doing all the wind computations, it really gives you very, very powerful tools for mastering that Raw Data ILS. Hopefully this discussion was helpful to you, and thanks for watching.